Today I'm going to show you guys how to replace the rear main seal and the oil pan gasket on your Jeep 4-liter. With any kind of engine work, I like to disconnect the battery, and really all I do is disconnect the negative, because later on we do plan on taking the starter off to make dropping the oil pan easier. After disconnecting the negative, we will raise the Jeep up and allow the suspension to droop. That way will give us more room to remove the oil pan from the Jeep. And then we'll move on to draining the oil. As you can see in this shot, my oil pan has seen better days, and I will be replacing it. Next we'll move on to removing the starter. I disconnect the starter solenoid first and then remove the 13mm nut holding the battery cable on to the starter itself. Once you have the electrical connections disconnected from the starter, you can remove the two 9/16 bolts holding the starter to the bell housing. The top bolt for the starter is pretty tricky. As you can see, the floor pan and the bolt have very little room between them. I actually used a swivel socket to remove this bolt. Once those two bolts are out, you can remove the starter. And then we'll reinstall the drain plug. And then we move on to removing the oil pan bolts. With there being some bolts with studs and some regular bolts on these oil pans, I like to take note of where the studs are, because they usually end up mounting some kind of electrical connection. What I'm doing here is, because I'm replacing the oil pan, I will take the bolt off and set it into the new oil pan in its exact same spot. That way I can kind of keep track of where these bolts go. The larger bolts that you'll find on this oil pan can only be threaded into the four corners of the actual engine block. You can definitely tell the difference between the two different sizes of bolts. Once you have all the bolts out, the oil pan is ready to drop down. It's kind of tricky to get it around all the lines and the pickup tube and all that, but it will come out. Once the oil pan is out, then we can get to scraping the mating surface on the block. I don't go too ridiculous here. I want the surface to be clean, but I don't want to remove any material from the block. From the factory, they use a small dab of RTV at all four corners of the oil pan. You'll have to remove the silicone. This right here is what I consider to be a clean mating surface for the gasket. My Jeep is a 2001 Cherokee. In 2000 and beyond, they all have this main girdle. This basically ties all the crank main journals together. You'll have to remove this to remove the rear main to get to the seal. These bolts are an 18mm. With the main girdle removed, now we can remove the rear main cap. I like to remove these bolts and then reinstall one of the bolts with a couple threads and then tap it with a hammer. That way the cap will separate from the crank and it doesn't drop straight to the ground. And then it's on to removing the upper part of the rear main seal. This can be kind of tricky, but you need to take your time. I just used an awl and tapped it with a hammer until I could get it out far enough I could grab it with a pair of needle nose vice grips, and you should be able to walk the seal out. I'm using a Pfirrman gasket. It's a one-piece design that's molded rubber, which I've had a lot of luck with in the past. These 4 inserts will screw into the corners of the block, and this will help you align the oil pan and the oil pan gasket together. The rear main seal that I got is also a Felpro. It comes with this little paper insert thing that'll help you get the upper part of the rear main seal into the housing. Also, I will be installing a new oil pan to replace the damaged one I had. This damage was from a previous owner, so I don't know where it came from or how I got there, but I am going to replace the oil pan. I'll have affiliate links to all these parts in the description below. We'll start reassembling this thing by putting in the lower half of the rear main seal into the rear main cap. You'll want to reinstall this seal exactly the same way you removed the old seal, with the lip of the seal facing the oil or the rear main bearing. With the lower half of the rear main seal installed into the main cap, I like to put a little bit of this Lucas heavy duty oil stabilizer onto the seal so that way it doesn't start spinning against the crank dry. Next up is feeding the upper half of the rear main seal up into the engine block. You're going to use this piece of paper to kind of feed the lip over the crank journal. That way it doesn't tear the lip. This is very easy to tear the lip on this seal, so take your time and feed it very slowly with very little pressure, and you should be able to get it. Then you can reinstall the rear main cap and torque it to spec. The specs that I found was a 3 torque process. So first you start with 40 foot-pounds. And then 70 foot-pounds. And then 80 foot-pounds. This helps reseat the rear main cap back onto the crank journal. And then we can reinstall the main girdle. This main girdle gets torqued to 35 foot-pounds. I like to start at the center of the crank and kind of work my way out in a clockwise fashion. Then we can install these little blue inserts. These things are going to hold the oil pan gasket up there while we try and snake the oil pan into position. I use a little bit of this ultra black RTV across the front cover and also on the corners of the rear main. This kind of helps these corners keep from leaking. And then you install your oil pan gasket onto those inserts. And then you can reinstall the bolts for the oil pan. Once the oil pan is reinstalled, you can reinstall the starter. I took this opportunity to change the oil in the Jeep. I'm using a Mopar oil filter, 1 quart of this Lucas heavy duty oil stabilizer, and then some Rotilla T5. This is a 10W30 weight. I use this oil because of its zinc content. Most conventional oils on the market today don't have any zinc in them. These engines actually need the zinc additive so that way the flat tappets don't wear out the cam lobes. Reconnect the battery, and then we'll fire this engine back up and check for leaks. I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.